Great. Okay. Welcome everyone to Big Tent Spotlight series with author and historian Anne Applebaum. Big Tent USA is an inclusive coalition of concerned citizens coming together to learn how to be a driving force for positive change in America. We value effective governance, decent, truthful leadership, and a positive solutions-oriented outlook. We focus on democratic ideals like voting rights and current issues like gun violence protection and healthcare. Our Big Tent community relies on us to be their go-to source for carefully curated content and training, all within the confines of our friendly and approachable Big Tent. In the coming weeks, we have more great speakers. Next week on Earth Day at 7 p.m., Dominic Browning, co-founder of Moms Clean Air Force, will be our spotlight speaker. Judd Legume, founder and author of the popular information newsletter, will be our Tent Talk guest on Tuesday, April 27th at noon. And on Tuesday, May 11th, also at noon, Louise Dubé, CEO of iCivics, will join Tent Talks. So we hope you'll keep coming back to Big Tent, and please check our website for more educational and engagement resources. And thank you for joining us this evening. We are so honored to have historian and Pulitzer Prize-winning author Anne Applebaum join Big Tent. Anne's compact but potent best-selling book, Twilight of Democracy, was released last summer to stellar reviews and has only gained in relevance and importance during the presidential election and its subsequent aftermath. At Big Tent, we knew that we needed someone with serious academic chops to moderate this important discussion with Anne. So we called on one of our past and my personal favorite spotlight speakers, Dr. R. Gordon Douglas. Dr. Douglas was educated at Princeton and Weill Cornell Medical College. He completed his residency training in internal medicine at New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell and the Johns Hopkins University. And then he completed his specialty training in infectious diseases at the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He has had a long and illustrious career serving as chairman of the Department of Medicine and physician-in-chief of New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center. These are such big names to say. I just have to say that. As founding president of Merck Vaccines at Merck & Company and chairman of Eris, a nonprofit biotech company with a mission to develop new effective vaccines for tuberculosis, the second deadliest infectious disease worldwide. Dr. Douglas is a member of the National Academy of Medicine, and he is my father. Before we start our discussion, I want to let you know that we have a change to our program tonight, given the headlines about the Johnson & Johnson coronavirus vaccine and the fact that we have Dr. Douglas with us tonight. He has agreed to stay on with Big Tent after a discussion with Anne Applebaum to give us an update on the current situation regarding the J&J vaccine, and we'll take questions at that time. So please feel free to stay with us past 6 o'clock for this brief conversation. And lastly, if you have not purchased Twilight of Democracy, please support a fantastic local bookstore, Diane's. The link will be in the chat, and get the book yourself because you're going to want to read it after this conversation. And remember to put your questions for Anne Applebaum in the chat. And at this time, I am so proud to turn the call over to Dr. Douglas.
Kitty, thank you very much. We are delighted to have Anne Applebaum with us tonight. She's a staff writer for The Atlantic and a senior fellow at the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, where she runs a project on 21st century disinformation. She was a Washington Post columnist for 15 years and a member of the editorial board. She's an author of 3 critically acclaimed and award-winning histories of the Soviet Union, including Red Famine, Stalin's War on the Ukraine, Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956, and Gulag, A History, which won the 2004 Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. Her newest book, which Katie mentioned, Twilight of Democracy, with a subtitle, A Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, appeared in July 2020. Her writing has also appeared in many publications, including the New York Review of Books, the New Republic, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, among many others. And we're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be with you, and I'm sorry that it's virtual or spiritual or whatever this is. and not physical. Maybe some other time.
You are free to go ahead now.
Okay, good. So thank you again. Thank you for the invitation. I'm, always pleased to talk to any group that describes itself as a big tent, because then it, definitely includes me. Although I suppose I should start by saying that my book is really not a book about big tents. It's a book about divisions. Maybe I'll say a few words about what made me write it. Those of you who've read it or flipped through to the first couple of pages know that it begins with a New Year's Eve party. And this is a New Year's Eve party that I held in 1999. It wasn't a fancy party. I'm not some kind of fantastic hostess. But the party was given at a moment when there was a tremendous amount of optimism in Europe, and in Eastern Europe in particular. I was then living in Poland. The party was at a house that my husband and I had bought a decade earlier and had very, very slowly renovated. It's a 19th century house that had fallen into, disrepair. And by 1999, it had a roof. It didn't have that much furniture, but that's okay. It was all right for a party. And the people who we had to the party were, again, nobody famous or important. They represented a kind of cross section of friends of ours. There were some came from London, one or two came from the US. Most of them were Poles. And most of the people there were, I would say, held together by, it's not even an ideology. I mean, you could have called them center-right, you could have called them Thatcherites, you could have called them anti-communists. They were people who had been a little bit too young to be leaders of the anti-communist revolution in Poland mostly, but certainly they were people who'd supported it. And they, if you'd gone around the room that night and asked, most of them would have been in favor of a Poland that was democratic, that was, that was where there were free markets, where there was a free press, a Poland that was integrated with Europe and with the rest of the world. Most of them would have thought of themselves as outward-looking people. When I started to think about that party again, this started to happen 2 or 3 years ago on its 20th anniversary. I began to realize that I suddenly realized that about half the people at the party, who I would have described as fitting into this same general rubric, were no longer speaking to the other half of the people in the party. Maybe this is an experience some of you have had. In 2019, I sat down and I thought about it, and I realized that there had been this political division in Poland, a real shift in political alliances, a change in people's attitudes, and that I could see it through the lens of people that I knew. A part of my friends and some of the people who'd been there, of course, are still my friends and still more or less what I would say we have the same worldview. But another part, a smaller part, had changed quite dramatically. And they had become members of, this is the Poles, although there were changes among my British and American friends too. But they had become members of, or in some cases, many of them were journalists who wrote in support of a very different kind of political party. It's the ruling party of Poland now. It's called Law and Justice. And it's probably best described as a kind of nationalist. I mean, we use the word populist. I don't really like that word, but a kind of nationalist authoritarian party. It's a party that describes itself as the only legitimate political party. They talk about themselves as true Poles, as opposed to, the traitors and foreigners and others who constitute the rest of the country. As soon as they came to power in 2015, they began an assault on the courts in Poland, which has resulted in division inside the court system. We now have a Supreme Court in Poland that is of very dubious legitimacy. Some of its verdicts are increasingly not recognized in other countries. But also they began to employ a very different kind of rhetoric and language. Again, nationalist rhetoric and language, xenophobic language of a kind that we hadn't heard in Poland in 25 years. I know people like to say, well, of course, this is only to be expected. It's a former communist country. But believe me, there was a 25-year period where we didn't have this kind of politics or this or these attitudes towards foreigners and outsiders and people of other religions and so on. And they brought all that back and they put it at the center of politics. And some of the people who did that were people that we knew. As I said, by 2015, 2016, they weren't our friends anymore, but we knew them. And so the book began, it was originally an article in The Atlantic, and it began as an attempt to explain why this had happened. And unlike a lot of books that you'll read about Trumpism or about populism, it doesn't try to give you one big thesis or one explanation. I tried to tell the story by looking at specific people, one or two who I knew in Poland, one or two who I knew in Hungary, one or two who I knew in America, a few also who I knew in Britain. And I looked at what drew people to this alternative set of ideas. My book is about people who are on the center right. There might be other kinds of stories you could tell about people drawn to extremism on the left. Actually, my first 3 history books were all books about Soviet communism. So I know there can be other forms of extremism, but the one that I experienced and that I witnessed was a move of people who had been in the center right towards a much more extremist radical right. And the explanations I came up with, if you read the book, you'll see that there, I look at the problem from different perspectives. I think the most important thing, though, to understand is that we're talking about a group of people who were, for a variety of reasons, very disappointed. Whether we're talking about my friends in Poland, whether we're talking about Laura Ingraham, the Fox News presenter, who is one of the subjects of the book, whether we're talking about my friend Roger Scruton, who was a British philosopher who became a kind of lodestar and was a sort of proto-Brexiteer. Many of the Brexiteers revered him as their kind of ideological leader. These were people who were profoundly disappointed with their countries in some cases, with modernity in other cases, with the direction of economic and demographic change in some cases, and in a few cases, disappointed with their own careers. In other words, their careers as mainstream journalists or as politicians weren't going well, being part of, parties that were sort of adhering to what had been the rules of politics up until then, weren't benefiting them, and they began to see opportunities for themselves in more extreme and more radical movements, and some of them became the spokesmen and voices for those movements. But this disappointment is, it's important to understand, in particular, again, I think speaking to this group, it's important to think about and explore. When we talk about people who have become disillusioned with their democracies or disappointed with the directions that their countries have gone in, or have become so nostalgic for previous eras, when they look back on other times and places, and they imagine those to have been better. Sometimes what they're talking about is something real or something that's worth acknowledging, that mainstream politicians also should understand. So, for many Poles, the transition from communism to democracy, of course it meant there was more freedom. Of course it meant there was more prosperity. And I should stress that in Poland, we're not talking about people who were somehow left behind. I mean, my friends and the people who I wrote about are not victims of the transition. They are not people who were impoverished by it. On the contrary, Poland is a real success story. I mean, really almost everybody who lives in the country has a higher living standard now than they did 20 years ago, and they certainly have a higher living standard than their parents. So if you compare anybody to their parents' generation, they are better off. I mean, this is true of all social classes and geography around the country. Nevertheless, there are people who felt that in this tumultuous period of change, that in this shift from one political system to another, from a country that was very isolated to one that's very integrated, to a country that was, almost hermetically sealed, to one that's really where it has open borders or open borders to Europe and where it's really part of the world. There are many people who felt that something was lost, whether it was the small town experience of my childhood, or the intimate relations that we had with people when I was growing up, or the status that I had as a coal miner, and which I don't have anymore in a society that really values entrepreneurs and and people with money. There's a sense of some kind of loss or some kind of disappearance of status, or sometimes a disappearance of a way of life. And this is actually something that's very typical of any country that goes through really rapid change. And so in the book, I also talk a little bit about some earlier eras where you had some similar forms of nostalgia or disappointment with modernity. One of them is 19th century Germany, which was an era when there was also very rapid industrialization. And you had this phenomenon of nostalgia, people saying, well, there was a better, pure, better time when, when people were real and we didn't have all this petty squabbling politicians, and we just had real leaders, real men who led the way. And these, some of that nostalgia played into what later became in Weimar Germany, again, a sort of nostalgia for a desire for a more unified political system. You had a similar feeling in 19th century France. I write a little bit about the era of the Dreyfus trial. This was a time of great, also political division inside France, when people chose sides, and people who'd previously been allies, somewhat like me and my friends in the 1990s, suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of the big issues of the day. Also often to do with the nature of the nation. Who are we? What kind of country are we? And this is also, of course, a period of great rapid ideological and political change. And in those times, people become nostalgic. They look for something older. They imagine there could be something different. And it's really in this disappointment with contemporary society that you get these forms of radicalism. Because really, if you begin to say to yourself, well, my society, as for example, the philosopher Roger Scruton did in England, my society is dead or dying. He wrote a book in which he spoke. He's an English philosopher, and he wrote a book in which he described as a funeral oration for my country. The English values that I grew up with are gone. If you really feel that, if you feel that something has disappeared, then why are you invested in the system as it is? Why not just smash it up or break it, or create some break with the present, move into the future? This is where radicalism comes from. And you can see you can see all across a lot of modern societies this kind of radicalism happening now. And I really think it's not a coincidence. And we live in an era of very rapid, as I said, economic change, demographic change, and also, as I discuss in the book, very rapid and very profound informational change. Really, when you take a step back and you look at all the societies that I wrote about, again, I write about Britain, I write about the US, I write about Poland and Hungary, I write a little bit about Spain, where I did some reporting a couple of years ago. But you could have included France and Germany and others as well. When you look at all these kinds of countries where you have this growth of nostalgia and this desire for unity and this frustration with politics, one of the unifying themes is the nature of modern information. The way that people get and process political information has changed. There's an enormous amount, of information. There's a kind of cacophony out there. There's a very wide range of views. There are angry and bitter arguments taking place all the time. And if you're somebody who is susceptible to those kinds of, or bothered by those kinds of disputes and arguments, then some kind of desire for silence, some idea that couldn't we just make it all silent? Couldn't we just have one leader? Couldn't we have unity? There's a part of the population that will always desire that. As some of you may know, and forgive me if I'm telling you things that you've heard from other speakers, the nature of modern social media also contributes to this sense of division and splintering. Simply because of the way in which the rules of public discourse are being set by the internet companies. So you have, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and many others, when they decide what they're going to send to your newsfeed or what they're going to recommend to you, they don't recommend things on the basis, that this is an exceptionally good rational argument, or this is a particularly civilized form of conversation. They're not looking to create civil discord. They're looking to create emotion, anger, and ultimately division. And one of the effects of that, again, is the sense that people begin to live in alternate, people now live in, these very different, very alternate media spaces. They are very apart from one another. They don't see that they have much in common anymore. And this too also creates a sense of disillusion and disappointment with centrist and mainstream institutions. I'll end this little introduction, and then I'm happy to take as many questions as you want, by reminding you of what exactly it was that happened in the United States on January the 6th. This was not an illustration of Republicans against Democrats. It was not a moment where we were witnessing polarization. What we saw was a group of people who had become disillusioned with the system itself. They'd lost their respect for Congress, for the office of the vice president, for the office of the speaker. They arrived at the Capitol wanting to disrupt the process because they no longer believed in it. And this, of course, is the end result of the kind of disillusion that I was talking about. I mean, once you cease to believe in the institutions, once you believe that democracy is so flawed or so pathetic or so, or the politicians are so despicable that they don't have to, that the rules and procedures don't matter anymore, this is when you get anti-systemic movements. So as I say, I've seen it in the version of a kind of political revolution in Poland. We had a version of it in the United States, before, during, and after the last election. And there are versions of it that you can see unfolding in other countries as well. So again, the book was an attempt to explore what some of the causes of this were, to explain some of the attractions of authoritarianism. And also, I should say, finally, to explode some of the myths we have. I mean, most of the people who I wrote about are, I mean, they're not especially wealthy, but they're not impoverished, they're not unemployed, they're not outsiders, they're not victims. They're all people who were ensconced in they're kind of elite. I mean, they're journalists, they're politicians, they're political spin doctors. They're people who are ensconced in their political systems who had nevertheless become disillusioned, who nevertheless wanted to see radical change. And so this tendency towards radicalism is something that can take place at any level of society. I'll stop there because I'm more interested in hearing your questions and responses.
Good. Anne, that was terrific, and thank you very much for that. We will have a bunch of questions, so I hope we can get through at least the majority of them. You start off talking about your party, your New Year's Eve party in Poland, which was very interesting, and how some of your friends diverged in thought after that. And the question is really, did they change, or did you change, or was it a 50-50 split?
So it's hard for me to say. I mean, I think I haven't changed. I think my views are consistent with what they always were. They would say I have changed. They would make the argument that I'm not conservative anymore. I'm not center right anymore. I don't really know what these terms even mean now. But I think the better way to look at it is that the situation changed, and that. And you can look at it this way. If you look at the same group of people who are my friends in the United States, the Cold War was a unifying moment. And if you look for example, if you look in the US, who were the Cold Warriors? Who were the anti-communists in the United States? They were actually, it was actually a coalition of people. It was people who were interested in realpolitik, who worried about Russian foreign policy, people who were concerned about nuclear weapons, people who were concerned about human rights and democracy. There was a lot of people who were Cold Warriors for that reason. Or it was people who were very religious because they believed that communism was atheist, which it was, of course. And they believed that fighting against communists was a kind of religious duty. One of the things that happened when the Cold War ended is that broad coalition, which in the US you would call, I don't know, Reaganite or Cold Warrior or center right, that coalition began to break up. And you could already see it breaking up actually in the 1990s. Probably it was artificially held together after 9/11. It's a sort of that general group stayed together for a longer period. But more recently, and particularly under the pressure of the Trump presidency, you've seen it, it break up much more comprehensively. I mean, something very similar to that happened in Poland. So when the issue was communism, and when we were all together in the fight against that, then that was the issue, and that became the thing that unified us. When the issue was, should Europe accept some refugees from Syria, then suddenly we all discovered that we had different views. Or when the issue was, how integrated should Poland be to the rest of the European economy, then we had different views. And so the nature of the issues changed, and the political alliances changed too, and the things that we had in common we no longer did. And I think this is something that's happened to the Republican Party in the United States, and really to center-right parties all over Europe. It's very similar thing happened in Britain as well to the Tory party, which is, I think, now unrecognizable, not very, very different to what it was 10 years ago.
Good, thank you. I'm going to just switch gears for a second. One of the things that I found fascinating in your book was sort of looking for root causes behind all this, and was Karen Stenner's work showing that a third of any population has this authoritarian predilection for order and homogeneity versus the remainder of the population that has this more libertarian predilection. And, if that's really true, then this will go on relentlessly forever. And you have to, if you are to maintain democracy, it's going to take constant vigilance and constant work. Is that holding up? And
so, if you think about it, the founders of America knew this to be true. I mean, when they were writing our Constitution, they were all reading the histories of the Roman Republic. Cicero was known even in a kind of pop form in the 18th century in America. They were reading the histories of the fall of Rome. They were reading about the histories of Greek democracy. And they were very hyper conscious of the fact that there is a human tendency to follow demagogues, that democracies often collapse into tyranny. And they actually structured, including some of the more awkward parts of our Constitution, for exactly that reason, to prevent, what they feared, which was demagoguery, the tyranny of the majority. And they put all the checks and balances of our Constitution in it for exactly that reason. And throughout quite a lot of American history, Americans were very aware that their system was fragile and could be fragile. I think that something happened, though, in the era after the Second World War, and in particular after 1989, when we had this moment of great liberal democratic triumph, that many of us became, and I'll return to Karen's work in a second, many of us became convinced of the inevitability of democracy, that it was so obviously the right system, that there was nothing special that we had to do. We could just kind of leave politics to the politicians, and the rest of us could go on whatever, writing books or making money, and it wasn't really our problem. And we forgot that there is of course many, there's a sort of human tendency, as Karen Stenner has described. There's a part of the population that's always been uncomfortable with conflicting views. There's a part of the population that has always found authoritarian slogans appealing. It's always been there. And it's really our job, if we want democracy to succeed and be maintained, to think about how to integrate those people and how to make them feel comfortable, particularly with this rapidly evolving multi-ethnic democracy that we live in America. We need to find ways of making sure that our system is, works for everybody who lives in it, because if we don't, then we've seen what can happen. Then you can get an anti-democratic or authoritarian movement even inside the oldest and most secure of democracies like ours.
Right. One another thing that sort of surprised me in your book was you talk about the elites, that it's really the college educated, people who are able to run the newspapers and be in the government and that kind of thing that are important in this authoritarian movement. But you don't say very much about the non-elites, the masses that follow. And, we hear about like Anne Case and Angus Deaton's deaths of despair, and the non-college educated white males in this country who have actually decreased by 1 or 2 years their life expectancy, and because of suicides and drug addiction and that kind of thing. So how do you tie those together, and what is the importance of the masses that follow the elites?
So because there had been so many excellent books by people like Angus Deaton on exactly this subject, my book is not about that. I thought, let's have a book that's about, the extremely well-educated, well-off people who are leading and running and doing the messaging for these authoritarian movements, because they often get ignored. People write about Trump, or they write about the working classes, and they don't write about this cadre of Fox News hosts in America or their equivalents in other countries. So it's not that I don't know that that those people exist. It's just that my book is about something different. I also have, of course, economics explain, or is part of the explanation for the doubts and the disillusion with democracy. I think actually the financial crisis of 2008 and 9 had a really important effect, just because it reduced so many people's faith in the knowledge and competence of our financial elites. And I don't think anybody ever really recovered from that, not just in the United States, but around the world. So I'm not downplaying how important that is. But it's also true that if you look at who supported, and I don't mean Republican voters, but who supported the anti-systemic movement inside the Republican Party, or who supported the law and justice government in Poland, or who supported Brexit, which is a slightly different issue, but related, in the UK, you will often find that they were not all the working classes, or they were not all, opioid addicts. It was very often middle class, well-off, successful people who have also supported these kind of movements. And sometimes it's, the better division, at least in Europe, it's often more accurate not to talk about it as a class phenomenon, but it's more urban rural or urban provincial. Very often it's kind of provincial elites against urban elites, or, regional against big cities. So of course, as I said, of course, economics plays a role in this, but it's not the only factor. It doesn't explain. Even I saw a study that came out a few weeks ago that looked actually, at people who'd been, in the Capitol on January the 6th, and looked at their socioeconomic status, and the majority of them were middle class. They were not, this was not the poor with their pitchforks storming the palace. These were middle class people objecting to democracy. Right.
If it did. To tie this point back to the one about Karen Stenner's work, is what it says then is, if you, for instance, the Biden administration tries to upgrade this group of people who are disadvantaged now by providing better jobs, better housing, healthcare, those kinds of things, is that going to change their mind? Is that going to swing their vote? Is that going to make a difference? Or because they have this authoritarian predilection, you can't change them?
So it's a predilection, but it's not immutable. So one of the things I like about Karen Stenner's work is she doesn't talk about authoritarian personalities, which was the old-fashioned term, predilection, that in certain circumstances, at certain moments, people can become disillusioned with democracy. That was her argument. I think what the important thing about what Biden is doing, and I think I have reason to think, I think it's deliberate. It's not just, it's not just that he's, attempting to help people on the lower end of the economic scale, but it's also that he's seeking to change the subject. so that what we're all talking about from day to day is not culture wars, Dr. Seuss, the Supreme Court, and all these very bitter cultural issues that divide us, but that we're talking about pragmatic, practical economic issues that have solutions, where there can be, I mean, there's a legitimate disagreement about how much money we should spend on infrastructure. I mean, everybody agrees we should spend some money on infrastructure. How much it should be and how it should be spent and that's the realm where we could have a useful political conversation that includes everybody. And the more conversations we can have like that about how much money to spend on the local bridge, and the fewer conversations we can have about existential issues about is America dying or, then the better our politics will be. And so, and historically, I mean, one of the ways that you can get countries and societies away from polarization is, as I say, to talk about issues and themes that are of common interest. And I do think that by focusing on economics, by focusing on fixing the virus, by showing that government can be effective, he at least has the, the possibility of being able to, persuade Americans to value their politics and their political system again. I mean, whether it can work, I don't know. I mean, we have, 4 years to try.
Yeah, that reminds me that one of the things I was going to ask you was your book came out in July, and you ended up, I think, on a fairly optimistic note. At least it came out that way to me. And but so much has happened since then. It was a big lie, the election, and then the denial of the result of the election, and then January 6th, which you've already talked about a little bit. But have you changed your optimistic outlook, or somewhat optimistic outlook, or do you think? How much trouble are we in? How do we solve the problem?
It's funny. Some people read the end of the book as not optimistic, so it's a.
Yeah.
Okay. But I came to the conclusion recently that it's for someone like me, like us, actually, like all of us on this call, it's really irresponsible to be pessimistic. And I can't say to my young adult children, everything's terrible and democracy is going to die. And I don't think it should be my role to do that. And how I ended the book was by saying that politics is radically open. Anything can happen. It is not inevitable. It is neither inevitable that we will go on being a democracy and everything will end and live happily ever after, nor is it inevitable that we will decline and decay. America has had these periodic revivals, these moments of reform and revision. You can look at the post-Civil War era, you can look at the progressive era and the, late 19th, early 20th century. You can look at, the New Deal era. There have been these moments when we've managed to restructure our institutions and revive ourselves. And I'm hoping that that's what will happen. But the point is that there is no guarantee. It depends what we all do and how engaged we are and whether we can inspire people to be part of politics again and not passive observers. So I am optimistic that there can be an American revival, that we can pull ourselves together, that we can find some kind of new political center, that it is possible, but I do not guarantee it. Yeah. I can't promise you that it's going to happen.
Well, let's keep our fingers crossed. So let's work towards it. Which brings me to the question of, okay, what can and should Big Tent do about this? Here's a group of very intelligent people who obviously are concerned. They're informed. They've worked hard in a number of ways. They worked hard in the election. Many of them made phone calls, wrote letters, did all kinds of things. What can they do? What would you advise them to do as a group to move forward our cause and prevent the kind of authoritarian slippage that we've seen in the past? And win the 24 election, yeah.
Get bigger, recruit more members, convince more people of a variety of political views that democracy itself is an important cause. Continue spreading the message. I mean, one of the real, I've said this already, but I'll repeat it. I mean, one of the real mistakes that many Americans made in the last 3 or 4 decades was to retreat from public life. And in a way, of course, this is encouraged by the internet. And as I said, by the rules of civic engagement on the internet, which are not the same as the rules of, the fact, we're having this civilized conversation here today, and the kinds of conversations you have with one another are not the same as the kinds of conversations you would have if we were doing it filtered through Facebook. And so convincing more people to have those kinds of conversations and to be part of your organization, this is what I think you should do. I think being involved in a nonpartisan way in elections, I mean, being registering voters, helping man election, helping being a poll worker, recruiting people to do those kinds of jobs, both in and around elections is also, it's a really important, and it's useful to remind people that our system is partisan. We have 2 parties, they believe very different things, they argue it out, but there are some parts of our system that are neutral. And anybody can participate in that. Anybody can work on behalf of the electoral system. Anybody can take part, and there are all kinds of ways of being civically engaged in nonpartisan ways. And I think reminding people of that is a hugely important task. It's a very, very important thing to be doing.
How about, let's change the topic, sorry about that, but does religion play any role here on either side?
I mean, religion is a tricky issue. So in Poland it did, which, there's more than you want to know probably. The Polish Catholic Church, which had been for many decades, actually centuries, a kind of national symbol. Even people who weren't Catholic or who weren't religious, paid homage to the idea of the church as an important national, because of its national role, because of the Polish Pope, because of the role it played in overthrowing communism, became over the last decade much more affiliated with one political party in Poland, with what's now the ruling party. And the partisan, the increasingly partisan nature of the church, which I think is, by the way, disconnected to the church's own fear that it was losing ground, that in a secularizing society, in a world with open borders where young people were traveling a lot, that it was losing its traditional role. And the church in Poland became the sort of embodiment of this fearful, nostalgic, and sort of reactionary and backward looking vision of the world that is embodied by one part of the Polish political spectrum. I think in the United States, you can't generalize in that way. I mean, clearly there's some American churches that have a similar function, and others that don't. I think actually religion, on the contrary, religious leaders and movements could play a really important role actually in building links across society. I mean, I spoke last night actually to a synagogue group, and I said exactly the same thing to them. I mean, aren't there ways in which they could reach out to people outside of their community? Could they be bridge builders inside their city? Religious leaders could be, because they're seen as politically neutral in a lot of places, they could be bridge builders and they could play an important role. I don't think religion has to be negative. I think it can be positive. I mean, as I said, there are instances in which it's played this negative role, but it's not necessary.
Thank you. Can we talk a little bit about COVID and both the response to the disease and then the vaccine rollout? I mean, it seems that some of the very authoritarian countries did a great job in controlling the epidemic, like China. They just locked things down in ways in which we couldn't do. And the most liberal democracies, the US and UK to use the example, did very poorly.
Well,
And
Actually,
the vaccine rollout is somewhat the reverse of that.
I've just written about this. Actually, many democracies did very well.
Yes.
Taiwan, South Korea, Germany, Norway, Switzerland, Canada, actually. In the first phase of the pandemic, before we had vaccines, it turned out that the real division was not between democracies and autocracies. There were a lot of autocracies that did really badly too, by the way. You know, Russia had a terrible, very high rate. The division was how much social trust you have, how much faith do people have in their public health system and their bureaucracy. You know, New Zealand is another one that did very well. And those countries that didn't have that, like America or Brazil or Russia. And so that was really that was the most important division. I mean, now the situation is changing, and what matters right now is, are you really good at vaccine logistics? And it turns out that the United States is good at that. We have, you know, National Guard, and we have the production capacity to make, you know, to produce this enormous. I mean, you know, the United States is what, I think we're almost at 50% of adults vaccinated now. There are some who are ahead of us, but nobody is ahead of us in numbers, you know, the sheer numbers of vaccines that have been given to people. And so the question of who's doing well and badly is now shifting very rapidly in America's direction. What I'm hoping is going to happen, and again, I just wrote something about this in the Atlantic, I'm hoping that the US will take advantage of this moment, and fairly soon, as we begin to, I think pretty soon we're going to have a majority of adults vaccinated, that the US begins to direct some of that logistic capacity and capability to the rest of the world. Having the US be it's you know, the US with the vaccines that are least problematic, and the capability that we have to produce them in huge numbers and to deliver them efficiently, I'm hoping we'll direct that outwards. And you know, it's not that I want to use it to repair our you know, the damage that's been done to America's reputation. I mean, that's part of it, but also just to show, you know, again how both, you know, how we can be both efficient and effective, as well as generous.
We clearly have an opportunity to lead here on that score. And, you know, one of the things I don't understand is what was in it for Trump to just totally not manage the epidemic, to worse than that, to deny it. I mean, it doesn't, I don't know how to fit this in with the rest of your thesis. You know,
I mean, that's it. Well,
maybe it doesn't have anything to do with it. You know?
We weren't talking about Trump at all. And Trump was a narcissist who was not interested in anybody but himself. And he saw the pandemic through one lens, and the lens was, will this help me get reelected or not? And so he was only, you know, I mean, even we had this, you know, it's grotesque set of stories that came out about the early days of the pandemic when they set up this team to manage it. It was supposed to be Jared Kushner was supposed to be running it. And then when they thought initially and incorrectly that the pandemic was only going to affect blue states, you know, New York and New Jersey, and East Coast states, they thought, well, then we're not going to have to worry about it because it's only, you know, blue states. Our state won't be affected. And they dropped the ball because this is how they saw the world. They were instrumental. They were not interested in Americans. They were interested in their own fortunes and their own, whether they would be reelected or not. So I don't think that's very hard to explain. You know, and I think he changed his mind once or twice about what the right attitude was, but essentially he never had any interest in Americans. He was not interested in the health of people. He was interested in what it meant for himself and his power.
Right. Thank you. What about, we haven't talked about social media very much, but a lot of people think that social media is one of the driving forces behind this change, and also news media, the way in which we get our news now.
So again, this is a big subject. Another thing I've written about recently. Yes, as I said, the rules that social media has set for public discourse are hugely damaging. You know, social media feeds the extremism, it feeds emotion, it feeds anger. The algorithms are set not to encourage us to engage in civilized conversation, but to be angry, to pass on messages, and above all, to stay online and look at advertisements. I mean, that's the purpose of social media from the point of view of the companies. But you are right that the nature of broadcast news doesn't help. And I actually think there's a much greater feedback loop between social media and broadcast media than most people realize. Very often when you look at whether it's Fox News or CNN, the way in which they've decided what topics they're going to discuss, the debates that they choose are often coming from Twitter. I mean, they're often, almost everybody who's in the news business is on social media. They see what's happening, they see what's trending, and that feeds and shapes their, what they present on television. And all the flaws of the news media that were there before have just become, sort of made hyperactive. I mean, the short attention spans, the need to do everything in very briefly, the belief that people won't watch longer and more in-depth programs, or they won't listen to them, which, by the way, is often wrong. I mean, one of the while we have the most, this kind of hyperventilating cable news in America, we also have this explosion in podcasts, including, you can listen to some go for some of the most popular, somebody like, I don't know if you all listen to Sam Harris or some of these other podcasters, they have these, 1 and 2 and 3 hour long conversations with people, go very in depth into subjects, and they can have 1 million listeners. So clearly what's happening in cable news and on social media is also driving this desire for something deeper. I mean, actually the Atlantic, where I work, has had this burst in subscriptions in the last year, partly I think for the same reason, because we do run longer articles and we do try to, I'm not going to say that everything we publish is perfect, but it does try to take subjects more seriously. So there is a desire for that out there. But you're right, there is this kind of death loop relationship between social media and broadcast media that does push emotion, anger, and above all, this political division that allows people to live in very different worlds.
Very different, right? One, we did talk a little bit about, things that we can do going forward. And one of them is what people are worried about, the lack of civics education in high school and in, where it should even further on in college. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that and tell us your ideas about how we might rectify that situation.
So I've been in a lot of conversations about civics education, and I don't understand the American school system well enough to be able to fully explain why it's so bad. And I know that it's so different in different states and even within states and in different cities and regions. But certainly, I mean, civics education is certainly something that should be baked into a curriculum at almost every level. I mean, kindergartners should have a version of it. And what worries me is that often, particularly nowadays, it's often presented, people learn the history of protest, or they learn the history of political change, and they aren't taught that much about some very basic values. I mean, what do we mean by the rule of law? Why do we need independent courts? They're not taught much about media literacy. How do you read a newspaper article? How do you judge whether it's good or bad? What are the clues that can tell you whether something might be true or false? Because, we don't have any more of this phenomena that, you get a newspaper every morning. That's the only thing you read. I mean, you're seeing news all the time and information all the time. It pops up on your phone in different forms, from your Facebook feed or from, CNN or wherever it's from. And teaching people about how to wade through that very difficult and complicated information ecosystem is something that really should be part of every school curriculum. It should be part of English. It should be part of history. It should be part of even science. I mean, people need to be taught about how does the internet work. How do companies target you? People should understand what it is, what is the technology that they're using, and have some way of coping with it. So I think the idea of civics education should be a lot broader than just learning how to name. I was taught actually as a child to name all the presidents. At one point I could do that. And that's sort of a nice, fun party trick. Or I could actually I can name all the prepositions as well. It's a fun party trick, but being taught, the deeper roots of these things, again, rule of law, independence of the courts, separation of powers, role of minority and majority, how do political parties function in our system? All of that, I agree, bumping that up. And I mean, you all, I'm sure, are in position in your communities to be trying to persuade, to lobby your schools. I mean, this is another thing that your group could do, to do more of this. Really a really important task.
Yeah, good, thank you. One of the things, your book is really largely about the European examples, and I'm reminded that you were in a position to see this coming in the United States much better than many of us were. We were sort of caught unawares by Trump and what happened, at least in the very beginning part of it, not later on. But so Europe had some problems with moving towards authoritarianism in certain countries before it happened here, before this threat was here. Are there any examples of successfully pushing back against it that we might use to help inform what we do?
So there are a number of examples, ranging from, again, leaders who have successfully changed the subject to get people to focus on, to move people away from culture wars. You can look at Merkel in Germany, was always very good at this. You can look at the reformation of parties. We have a difficulty in our system that our party system is so stiff, and parties can really only be reformed kind of from within. I mean, the coalitions, that make up the parties can be altered. But you have in Europe, for example, this flowering of green parties, who have, which are not, which a long time ago had the reputation of being kind of flaky, environmental, and now there's some Germany has a very serious, very interesting Green Party, which has a very interesting foreign policy. And green parties, liberal parties, Macron's party in France is very interesting, for example. Looking to, people who have been successful at fighting this kind of populist authoritarianism have often been able to create new coalitions. I mean, I think maybe that's the important lesson. Look around you, who is adjacent to you? Who might you be able to convince to join you? Who are the people and groups in your community who might be, who could you build an alliance with? Politics is all about building alliances and widening and deepening your alliances. And I think the countries that have been successful in fighting back against this are those where successful new alliances have been created.
Well, I have to jump in and because we're just after 6, and I just want to say thanks to my dad. And I really want to thank you so much for coming to Big Tent. And I hope you don't mind me paraphrasing you as a way to just sort of summarize, I think, what you've given us. And this was something that you said when you appeared at the Brennan Center in August 2020. And you said that one of the goals that you wanted to achieve with your book, Twilight of Democracy, was that it would serve as a clarion call against our complacency. And Anne, I think you achieved that goal tonight. I know that we at Big Tent have heard you loud and clear, and I think everyone on this call has as well. And we will continue to educate ourselves and stay very, very, very diligent in our dedication to our democracy and to expand our Big Tent. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for spending this time with us. And if people want to stay on our call, my dad is going to stay on as well to just give us an update on the J&J vaccine. So Anne, can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much. Best of luck. Keep doing what you're doing, and thank you all. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Fantastic.